this is Lucas again, Chewie painting. Today we will be painting this Stormtrooper. I will go step by step through the single steps. So without further talking, let's get right into it. For the priming part, it's really important that you're not using pure white on the entire model. Rather prime it with a darker gray, highlight it with a Dawnstone grain, and use white only as highlight. Okay, so after airbrushing, the mini should look something like this. It should be off-white compared to the circle. And next step is applying some contrasts. So we will try to darken certain areas. So let's go. All right, we are starting the miniature with a bluish gray. I've used Incubi Darkness, but you can use basically anything for the weapon. And all the other parts of the Stormtrooper, like all the details like the gloves and in between the armor, I'm just using a black. I'm using the Kimera colors black. I really like it because they have a high density of the pigments and it's really covering very, very well, but you can use basically any black color will do it. So as you can see, I'm working with a very fine brush because this is already detail work straight in the beginning, and I'm picking out all the details in the helmet and in between the armor parts. Take your time with this step, be really careful. I know it takes a lot of time, but it's totally worth it. Same with the next step, which is basically a thin black, which is Nuln Oil. All of you probably know this wash from GW, and I'm just using it for all the recesses on the armor. So we're using the pure black for in between the armor and the Nuln Oil, which is not as strong for on the armor. So you can see I'm using it to do some shading where it would be logical, like on the sides and below where the light wouldn't hit the model. And in this step you can be a little quicker and rougher, and it doesn't matter if you hit parts that would actually be highlight spots, because later on we will go in with a white tone and correct all of our mistakes. So you can be quite quick with this one in comparison to the previous step. Okay, now your commander Stormtrooper has all the recesses filled up, and in the next step we will clean up all the parts in between, and any mistakes that we've made we can cover up now, so don't worry. Before we get to the white armor, I will paint an orange shoulder pad for this Stormtrooper commander. I will show in the end some alternatives. You can also paint it black, or I will also include one where I've painted it with camo. So you can see some different variation. It doesn't really matter, whatever you prefer. I like to mix it up, so if I have 4 troops of Stormtroopers, I will probably all paint them in different shoulder pad colors. So here you can see the next step for the weapon. It's basically a bluish tone with a little bit more white than in the previous step, and I'm doing rough highlights. You can pick out the spots that you want. You can do this more or a little bit less than I have done. This is quite prominent how I did it, and then including the white. And I've been quite rough with this because I will wash this with Nuln Oil afterwards so that the transitions get a little bit more smooth, and the entire weapon will get more of this dark black look. So for all the gloves and the black parts, I will be doing some highlights with the Dawnstone color. You can basically also just mix a little bit of white into black tone, and then like in this step adding more and more white for some final highlights. And as already mentioned, here comes the Nuln Oil over the weapon. You can see how it kind of does a transition between the very bright bluish tones, and we will also apply this to the gloves. And then we can finally move on to the most interesting part, how to paint the white armor. And we've done all the previous work, and now the fun part begins with using pure white. As before, I'm using the Kimera colors white because it's a great color, and I really like the pure black and the pure white. But any white will do, except for the GW Corex white because it's crap. But yeah, as you can see, I'm picking out all the highlight tones and correcting all the stuff that Nuln Oil has messed up. And it's basically a mixture between highlighting and fixing your mistakes, but it's really fun because you can see how the undercoat is not pure white. It's really important that for the airbrushing or the priming of the model, you don't use a pure white, because then the highlights will just disappear or not be visible. But if you're very subtle in a very subtle gray close to white, then the highlights will actually pop out and you can see a difference, which is also why it makes so much fun to paint on top of the Nuln Oil, because it's a very decent and not pure black. If you're having trouble to choose what areas to highlight, just think of the light coming from above. So anything that's on top of the miniature is getting brighter parts, and anything that is covered or below something is probably kept in the original color, and you don't need to highlight that. But especially like the corners I just painted on the side of the armor, they kind of give a good contrast to the cloth, which is the next texture next to it. So you kind of differentiate the two surfaces from each other, which also helps to read a model better. So in this case, it's probably less realistic, but I like the look of that a lot. But that's totally up to you where you put your highlights. But probably like here, the front armor part is an important one, and you can see how I'm cleaning up the Nuln Oil below that, and now it looks really nice and neat and clean again. For bigger surfaces like here on the legs, I've thinned down the white quite a lot so I can move the paint around, and once the color has dried, I will go in with pure white and set final highlights. And like this, with this wet blending technique, you can do little transitions inside of the surfaces, giving the model even better look. The more time you invest here, the better it will look in the end. And that's it for the white armor. As a next step, I will use some snakebite leather to pick out his gun holster, his leather holster on the side, and just do a base coat. And since the Nuln Oil on the weapon has dried in the meantime, you can come back and do some tiny little white highlights on it to give it that final touch. Now for your Stormtrooper, you've cleaned up all the armor, everything's white and shiny and nice again, and we will do it dirty again now. And for this technique, you will need a sponge, and you will need to rip some part of it, go into a black or brown tone, and very important, take a piece of paper, get rid of the excess color, and then do this. So I'm holding the sponge with some tweezers, and I'm very gently tipping onto the armor. It's very important to not overdo it. You can ruin everything you've done before, but really little subtle highlights or dirt can make a huge difference on a model. So here you can see how I'm preparing the sponge again, wiping it off on a paper towel, and then getting back to the model, adding tiny dots and scratches. Usually it's quite realistic to do it around the corners or edges, because surfaces tend to get damaged there the most or used there the most. At some point it's enough, and then you can move on to the leather part again. I'm using some XV88 and highlighting it with a little bit of white for some highlights on top of the leather weapon holster. After this step, we're kind of done with the mini and just the base is left. So I'm picking out a good spot where the mini could stand and taking some super glue to glue it onto that spot and letting it dry for a couple seconds. And then I'm going in with some pigments. I'm using Vallejo Pigments Sienna Natural here. Taking an old brush and just like working the pigments into the model. And I'm focusing on the lower parts of the model because those are the parts that are exposed to the sand the most, and also working the pigments into the base to give it a more of a sandy look, and then just wiping off any excess and blowing a little bit away. And then my favorite part, always taking a black brush and covering the rim of the base. Okay. We finished the mini and it should look something like this. As promised, here are also some alternatives with a camo look in the middle and a black one on the left. Just choose whatever you like best. Okay, this is the tutorial. I hope you liked it and learned something. And you can use this on any miniature with white armor. It doesn't have to be a Stormtrooper, obviously. If you liked the video, please subscribe and leave a like.